Loretto, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Delighted that you've joined this course over 6 weeks. We thought that being the centenary of the formation of Northern Ireland, but earlier in December, the centenary of the Partition of Ireland, it would be good to hold a course looking at that particular theme. And that we'll do over 6 sessions. Tonight, I'll introduce the theme for this evening in a moment, but the next session is the 1st of June, actually. We have a gap next week, but then we look at the Road to the Government of Ireland Act and Partition. On week 3, we turn to the birth of confessional states. On week 4, the partition of Irish Unionists. Week 5, the partition of Irish Nationalists. And on the 6th and final week, which is the 29th of June, what do we do with the future? So we're not going to exclusively simply look at the past, but we'll also be looking at what the future might hold as well. It is part of public theology at Drumalis, and though this is very much to do with history, nevertheless, there will be major public ethical questions, and they will never be far away from our discourse and conversation. And I hope we can engage freely in conversation when it comes to that point. For those who may be here for the first time, the kind of format is some input, and then we, this evening, will hold an open discussion after the first input. We'll take a little break for coffee or tea for about 10 minutes, come back to second input, and at the end of that, we will go into smaller groups where we can engage with each other in conversation together. So we're looking this evening at Drumalis House and Gun Running. And the title, I need to say immediately, is not meant to suggest that the Sisters of the Cross and Passion were involved in gun running. Nor does it mean that Sisters Margaret, Rose and Anna are seasoned gun runners, not at all. But before Drumalis in Larne, where we usually meet, before Drumalis in Larne became a retreat and conference centre with the order, it was a big house and abode of the Unionist family of Smiley. Furnishings and photographs from that era are still there in Drumalis, and the history is still visible and acknowledged. Now, those of you who have been to Drumalis will have been, I'm sure, in the very room where the 1914 gun running was planned. You've sat there perhaps in a retreat session, in prayer or meditation, or in theology discussions, perhaps oblivious to the history that surrounds you. Many years ago, it was in that same room that a large group of us met to explore and then bring about the first community relations and interchurch group in Larne. It was a considerable achievement and was not lost on us that we founded a group to express and promote good relations and better understanding in a space where bringing guns into Larne for the newly formed UVF was organised and planned. From gun running to community relations and reconciliation was quite a journey in history, and perhaps shows how unpredictable history is and how history can and does turn on some significant hinges, and that transformation is always possible. Drumalis House and gun running is part of a larger history that led to the partition of Ireland in December 1920 and to the formal foundation of Northern Ireland on the 3rd of May 1921. We will be looking at that in the next session. Drumalis House and gun running is part of that long road going back centuries. By 1886, British Prime Minister William Gladstone decided that Ireland should be given home rule, which would include the return of an Irish Parliament as a form of devolution still within the British Empire. Gladstone's bill was defeated in the House of Commons, and he and his government were out. He became Prime Minister again, and now an old man, introduced a second Home Rule Bill in 1893, much as the first one. This time it got through the Commons, but was defeated by the House of Lords. That, at least for the moment, was the end of the bill and the end of Gladstone's political life. Within a few years, he was dead. Home Rule for Ireland did not go away. Indeed, the demand in nationalist Ireland increased as the unionist opposition to Home Rule also increased. From 1886 and evolving unionism, there had been talk of resistance that would involve guns. And though this was the position of a minority in emerging unionism, guns were being acquired. Unionism, as it emerged and became formalized in 1905, was Irish unionism, drawing unionists, mainly Protestant, from the island of Ireland and resisting Home Rule for all of Ireland. By 1910, there was a constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom. The Lords, with a Conservative Party majority, having rejected the second Home Rule Bill in 1893, now did the unthinkable and rejected Lloyd George's People's Budget. The budget had been described as a tax on the rich, and the Conservatives were the rich. And so the Lords threw out the budget. This led to 2 general elections in 1 year, as well as radical reform of the Lords. Both elections resulted in hung parliaments, with the Irish Parliamentary Party led by John Redmond holding the balance of power. If Henry Asquith's Liberal Party was to govern, he needed the Irish nationalists. Redmond had leverage, and soon Asquith was bringing forward a third Home Rule Bill. Reform of the Lords meant that they could only reject a bill 3 times, after which it would go back to the Commons and become law. Unionists realised that by 1914, Home Rule for Ireland would become law, and a parliament in Dublin would be restored. It was still a form of devolution within the United Kingdom and the Empire, not unlike in some ways what was given to Scotland and Wales in 1997. In Ireland at this point, there is still a militant minority who really want independence and freedom and will use arms if necessary to achieve it. Unionists are opposed to Home Rule for any part of Ireland, but by this point, the Ulsterisation of the problem is the reality, and Irish unionism is under stress as Ulster unionism becomes the focused political entity. The possibility of partition also becomes a consideration, but with no agreement about which counties or how many might be partitioned. Ulster resistance to the third Home Rule Bill intensifies, and militancy and the threat of guns increases. The Ulster Unionist Council makes money available for guns in 1910, and other sources of money also become available, a lot from British Conservative sources. Eventually, a large sum of money is available, some say up to £1 million, but this figure is disputed. The Ulster Covenant is signed on the 29th September 1912, an inseparable combination on the day of religious fervour and political passion to resist by any means necessary the conspiracy of Home Rule. That meant guns. And guns were coming into the northeast of Ireland since 1910. With militancy increasing, an illegal army was formed in 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force, with up to 100,000 membership. Later in 1913, the Irish Volunteers were formed with similar numbers. Neither had any intention of being comic opera armies. And 1 year later, both acquired guns from Germany. Ireland was on the brink of civil war. The gun running for the UVF was planned in Dromalis House, home of the wealthy unionist family of Smiley. And the architect of the UVF gun running was Fred Crawford. Now later we will meet the key figure in the Irish volunteer gun running, Roger Casement, also a Protestant, as were all of the volunteer gun running organisers and planners. The unionist and nationalist gun runners were all Protestants. I'm not sure what that says about Protestants and guns. The key player in the UVF gun running was Fred Crawford. Crawford had Scottish roots, a 17th century ancestor being the Reverend Thomas Crawford, a Scots Presbyterian minister buried in Donegal in County Antrim. 3 generations of Presbyterian ministers followed. The last, William Crawford, whose brother Alexander founded a bleach works at Lisburn. For some reason, Alexander deserted the Presbyterians and became a Methodist. His grandson Fred inherited the business and was brought up in a solid Methodist home. Fred was educated at Methodist College and was a devout, practicing Methodist, holding office in the church and serving on a central church committee responsible for missionary activity. I suppose there is a moral incongruity about Fred, a business person who, if his business had gone bankrupt, according to the rules of the Methodist Church in Ireland, he would have had to resign all offices held in the Methodist Church. He could not have served on his beloved missionary committee. Those rules still exist for bankruptcy in Irish Methodism. Bankruptcy meant resignation from all office. But it was all right to smuggle guns and ammunition. Nobody in Methodism then seems to have noticed any moral incongruity or moral irony. In the highly charged political atmosphere of the time, gun running and ethics did not connect. Crawford was a military-minded person and was bringing in small quantities of weapon from England from 1893. He created a young Ulster movement, which engaged in military drilling and the manufacture of ammunition. Crawford was a veteran of the Boer War, and all this military experience he brought to unionism. Crawford was the prime mover in the creation of a secret subcommittee of the Ulster Unionist Council in 1910 to consider and plan for weapons importation into the northeast of Ireland. Crawford was commissioned to look for and purchase arms. Guns were intercepted in Hammersmith and Leith. And the fact that small quantities were being brought in, the fact was small quantities were being brought in by Crawford, by a Robert Adgate and a William Johnston. And when Ulster Unionist leadership contacted Crawford in early 1914, he was reluctant to become seriously involved in a large-scale mission because of the interceptions, and he was unconvinced that a powerful militant organization like the Orange Order was serious about armed resistance. In January 1914, the Ulster Unionist Council formally approached Crawford about procuring arms from Germany. There already is at this stage the build-up of tensions and the looming possibility of war with Germany at this point in 1914. Yet the Unionist Council, through the most militant unionist of the time, is prepared to make contacts in Germany to purchase arms from the Germans so that they could fight the British to remain British. Apart from the treasonous activity, there is a moral deficit here and a deficit in rationality and logic, except that is not the Unionist ideology and mindset. It is not Ulster Unionist Protestant political and theological thinking. Since the Act of Settlement in 1688, Protestant loyalty was to the monarch and not to the government. This was a Presbyterian tradition, and unionism was shaped by the Presbyterianism of the Scottish planters. In 1912 and 1914, unionist thinking was still embedded in the 17th century contractual theory of government. Any allegiance to government was conditional, and if the government was failing in its duty, it was justifiable, even a duty, to rebel and to resist. James Craig has already told the House of Commons that the government is not to be treated as a government, but as a caucus led by rebels. By introducing Home Rule for Ireland, the government was failing in its duty, and since ultimate allegiance was to the monarch and only conditional in relation to government, it was justifiable and it was right to fight the British to remain British. And this contractual theory of government is still alive in the Unionist mind. Crawford negotiated arms with Bruno Spiro, a Jewish arms dealer in Hamburg. A few months earlier, in August 1913, Edward Carson had been on holiday in Germany and had a brief meeting with Kaiser Wilhelm. There were connections in high places. In Bergen, Norway, Crawford bought a Norwegian coal boat, the SS Fanny. Crawford came back to Belfast for briefings with Unionist and UVF leadership and then joined the Fanny in the Baltic. The old coal boat had 24,000 modern rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition on board. 6 Maxim machine guns were bought and delivered through another arrangement. The Fanny left the Baltic in a gale and sailed for the Wexford coast, where guns and ammunition were transferred to the SS Clyde Valley, which then sailed for the Down and Antrim coastlines. The UVF Motor Car Corps received the all-important order, quote, "Your car should arrive in Nairn in the night of Friday, Saturday, 24th, 25th at 1 a.m. punctually, but not before the hour, for a very secret and important duty." The gun running planned in Drumalis House arrived on the 25th of April 1914 and all unloaded at Larne and Donaghadee and Bangor. A decoy ship had gone to Belfast Lough and diverted the attention of the authorities. There was no interference with the landing of the 216 tons of modern rifles and ammunitions. Cars sped off into the darkness to take the arms to prepared dumps all over Ulster, the 9-county province. Liddy Smiley stored some of the arms in Drumalis. 600 cars were used, half of the cars in Ulster at the time, each with a UVF driver. Jonathan Barden said it was the first significant use of the internal combustion engine in military history. The gun was now introduced again to Irish politics, and the UVF was significantly armed and made a big contribution to militant separatism. The government in London described it as criminal and treacherous, and although the cabinet met 4 times in 4 days to discuss the gun running, no arrests were made and no person questioned, certainly not Fred Crawford. Later, Crawford advocated the reforming of the UVF at the time of partition, and it was revived largely as the B Specials. The guns were still around, some used to arm the police. But where the rest were concerned the new Northern government. There were guns kept in government storage, and in 1927 they were yet again discussed. Who would dispose of the weapons? Fred Crawford had a temporary post in the civil service, lost his post in cuts, but Prime Minister Craig thought Crawford should have some reward for his services, and so a post in the civil service was created for him, with the responsibility of dealing with the UVF arsenal. In 1942, Crawford was still trying to sell arms. Arms do not disappear easily. Fred Crawford, the most influential militant unionist of the Home Rule era, died in 1952. Ireland had been partitioned for 31 years when he died, and 3 years later a border campaign of violence began, which came to little. A decade later, things seemed to be improving for community relations in Northern Ireland, but it was a false dawn. Too much was contested. Too much needed reformed if Northern Ireland was to be a shared space of political and social equality. The old UVF was revived again in 1966 and murdered Catholics and a police officer. By 1969-70, the community was falling apart. Guns were well and truly at the centre of politics. Guns dominated for the next 3 decades and more. Though we got a peace process agreement in 1998, there is unease again that Loyalist and Republican guns might return with another generation willing to waste their own lives and destroy others. Guns or the way of death. I suppose a community now has, again, perhaps to choose life, which means a way of justice and peace. I think we're all back on the wavelength again, or at least those of us who are off the wavelength, but I want to look at the other person we've already mentioned. And just over the hill from Larne is the town, as you know, of Ballymena. It's a unionist heartland, and for many years its MP was the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, and his son still holds the seat. And Ballymena is also known as the Bible Belt of Northern Ireland. It is a Protestant town with a relatively small Catholic minority. There is a famous photograph from the gun running era of a drumhead service in Ballymena with a Church of Ireland bishop blessing UVF guns. And other Protestant clergy were involved. And the Protestant churches at this stage seemingly had no difficulty with the gun in politics. The Church of Ireland Presbyterian and Methodist leaders had been among the first 7 signatories of the Ulster Covenant in 1912, pledging to use any means necessary to defeat the Home Rule conspiracy. And good practicing Methodist Fred Crawford had delivered a huge consignment of guns from Germany, planned in Dromala's house, Larne, and landed there on the 25th of April 1914. Well, Ballymena produced another Protestant gun runner. Only this time the Protestant acquired the guns for the nationalist Irish Volunteers. Roger Casement was born in Sandycove, Dublin in 1864. His mother was a devout Catholic and his father a rebel Protestant. Casement family members lived near Ballycastle and in County Wicklow. His father Roger served with the British Army in India. And as a Protestant, he had sympathy for the Fenian movement, was influenced by the Fenian Rising of 1867 and by the hanging of the Manchester martyrs. And this was not altogether unusual, as it had resonance with the Liberal Party views given expression by William Gladstone, who was on a moral mission to bring peace to Ireland and mark a changing imperial attitude towards Ireland. The Casement family had a somewhat itinerant existence, living for a while in St. Helier, Jersey. Roger Casement's mother died in childbirth, and 4 years later, in unexplained circumstances, his father died in Ballymena. With his 2 brothers and a sister, the children became wards of an Uncle John and moved to John's farm at Macharan Temple in the glens of Antrim above Ballymena. Here, Casement was surrounded by stories and memories of the British Empire. Casement was educated at Ballymena High School, a Church of Ireland school. The principal, the Reverend Robert King, was a prominent Irish scholar. For all that, Casement complained often that his education did not include Irish history or the Irish language. He was deeply attached to the glens of Antrim and became aware of people there speaking Irish. He may not have learned any Irish history in school, but he read much and he read widely, and he identified with the heroes of Gaelic Ulster, and in particular the United Irish Rebels of 1798 and 1803, the latter date of a rising led by Robert Emmet. Casement, the Protestant, was being shaped and formed by the ideals of the United Irishmen, the resistance of the Gaelic chiefs, and the vision of the young Irelanders. Any hope of some peaceful resolution to Irish hopes and dreams was shattered in 1882 by the Phoenix Park murders of 2 high-ranking British officials in Ireland. And 4 years later, Gladstone introduced the first Home Rule Bill. Casement worked for a while with the Elder Dempster shipping line, but then set off to other parts of the British Empire and ended up in sub-Saharan Africa. Casement was from 1892 in the service of Empire, joining the British Colonial Service. It was in this role that he acquired an international reputation as a great humanitarian. He produced a highly significant report on the exploitation of African workers by European employers. That was followed by a similar expose of the unjust and oppressive treatment of Amazonians in South America. In 1911, the British gave him a knighthood, and he retired from colonial service in 1913, the year when the UVF and the Irish Volunteers were formed. Casement may have been in imperial service, but his sense of Irish nationalism had been growing. He had exposed imperial injustices in Africa and South America. The empire had knighted him, but he was becoming increasingly aware that the same empire was responsible for injustice in his home country, Ireland. Casement had joined the Gaelic League, and he was involved in the setting up of the Irish Volunteers in November 1913. Casement came to believe that if Ireland was to be independent and free, then German help was necessary. Not long after the outbreak of war in 1914, the Irish Republican Brotherhood decided on a rising. Sir Roger Casement was in America, and on the advice of the Clan na Gael leader John Devoy, he called on the German ambassador in Washington. Now remember, Casement is, after all, an influential figure. He is Sir Roger Casement, a former British imperial consul. He's a Ballymena Protestant. Edward Carson could call to visit Kaiser Wilhelm, and so Casement went to Berlin, and he called on the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg to arrange for German arms to be sent to Ireland. This was 1916. But in 1914, Casement had already been a key player in the German arms that had arrived in Howth and Kilcoole in County Wicklow. The earlier gun running had been in response to the UVF gun running. Now, there was nowhere near the same quantity of arms arriving for the Irish Volunteers. The UVF were by far the better armed. But two illegal armies, each with up to 100,000 members and with arms, made a civil war look likely. Two things to note here. The gun running in Ireland in 1914 that armed Unionists and Nationalists was led in both cases by Protestants. Crawford was Protestant, though there were some Catholic members of the UVF, which seems inexplicable. Casement was a Protestant from Ballymena, and the whole operation in Howth and Kilcoole was a Protestant-led and organised operation. Casement supplied a lot of the finance, while Protestants Alice Stopford Green, Darrell Figgis, and Mary Spring Rice were the organising committee. Molly and Erskine Childers with Conor O'Brien were the crew who brought the guns to Ireland. James Creed Meredith and Sir Thomas Miles with the Quaker Bulmer Hobson were the onshore coordinators. They were all Protestant and nationalist gun runners. Protestants organised the guns to fight the British to stay in the Empire, and Protestants organised the guns to fight the British to leave the Empire. I suppose Irish history is never straightforward, but always somewhat confusing, interesting, also very tragic. From Howth, the gun runners, unlike the UVF, made no attempt to move the weapons at the dead of night under cover of darkness. They walked to Dublin in broad daylight, and when they reached Bachelor's Walk, the British Army was waiting, opened fire, and 3 people were killed. That was in contrast to the turning of the blind eye to what was happening in Larne, and the inconsistency of the security forces was noted. On the 17th of March 1916, St. Patrick's Day, German Naval High Command met in Berlin and decided to send 20,000 rifles and 1 million rounds of ammunition to Ireland. Captain Carl Spindler, commanding the Odd, arrived in Tralee Bay on the 20th of April, but the Russians had tipped off the British, who anyway had cracked the German radio codes. The Odd was intercepted and escorted to Cork Harbour. There, Captain Spindler scuttled the ship, and the ship and its arms went to the bottom of the River Lee, or somewhere near its mouth. The Germans had not fulfilled Casement's expectations, and though Casement was being returned to Ireland by German U-boat, he was returning to insist that the planned Easter Rising be postponed. He was unable to convey that message because on landing on Bannistrand in Kerry, he was arrested by 2 constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary and taken by pony and trap to Ardfert Police Station. Next morning, he was walked through the streets of Tralee to the train station and on to Dublin to Arbour Hill Barracks. There he was strip searched, but refused to make a statement. And under a heavily armed escort, he was taken to Kingstown, now Dunleary, and by boat to Holyhead. He arrived in Holyhead on Easter Sunday morning, still unable to get his message to those in Dublin to call off the rising. The rising did go ahead, and after 6 days was easily put down by British forces. It had failed, but when the British military decided to execute 15 of the rising leaders, the failed rising became perhaps the most successful failure in Irish history. From that point, Ireland was on its way to leaving the empire, though not without much violence and killing, and the worst killing fields being Belfast and Cork. On the 23rd December 1920, Ireland was partitioned, with all the legacies that has left us. Meanwhile, in London, Casement was questioned by 3 intelligence chiefs: Captain Reginald Blinker Hall, Basil Thompson, and Major Frank Hall. These were the top people who had been tracking Casement for some time. Thompson was the son of the Archbishop of York and a high flyer, becoming Prime Minister of Tonga at aged 29. He was severe in the way that he treated suffragettes and Irish sympathisers. Blinker Hall was one of those superior imperial types, establishment and ruling class. Frank Hall had played a leading role in the organisation of the UVF and was a key player in the gun running into Larne in 1914. He was military secretary to the Ulster Volunteers, leading British intelligence, and now interrogating Casement. The interrogation left Casement shocked, and he was told that he was being held under the Defence of the Realm Act. Casement was eventually tried for treason, and the trial attracted huge public attention. There were also many appeals on Casement's behalf. The government set out to discredit Casement by publishing extracts from diaries detailing homosexual activities. Those extracts have always been controversial, their authenticity being questioned, though many accepted them as genuine. Publishing such extracts, genuine or otherwise, was to discredit Casement, assassinate his character, and all while a trial was taking place. The government was successful. Casement's reputation was destroyed, and the authorities took control of the high moral ground. In Angus Mitchell's words, more importantly, the controversy continues to obfuscate Casement's lasting significance. Casement had a lot of support, but it was all met by what Mitchell calls the cold, haunting power of official silence. As he approached his execution, Casement rose above bitterness, forgave his enemies and captors, saying, "All are my brethren now." Crawford was a devout Methodist. Casement was Anglican, always drawn to the mystical side of Christianity, especially the writings of the early church fathers as they are described. The Anglican and the Church of Ireland bishops faced a dilemma. In Ireland, the bishops were all unionists, one publicly blessing UVF guns in 1914. The Archbishop of Canterbury wriggled by telling the Lord Chancellor that reprieve would be better than execution, but the well-being and safety of the empire was at stake. And Archbishop Randall Davison even opined that Casement was mentally and morally unhinged. Casement, the Protestant, was at the last received into the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church had little sympathy for Casement, and Cardinal Bourne of Westminster demanded that Casement sign a confession before he could be confirmed Catholic. A Father McCarroll heard Casement's last confession, gave him his first communion, and the rites of the Church at the end. McCarroll said later that Casement went to his hanging with the dignity of a prince. At 9 a.m. on the 3rd of August 1916, Roger Casement, long stripped of his knighthood, was hanged. The 16th rising person to be executed in 1916. He was buried in the prison yard, and in 1965 his remains were returned to Ireland, where they received a state funeral. Roger Casement, the Protestant gunrunner from Ballymena, was tried for treason and executed. Fred Crawford, the Protestant gunrunner who sat in Drumalis House, Larne, planning and then carrying out a huge gun-running operation, and who would have heard Edward Carson tell Unionists not to be afraid of illegalities, and who knew that what the Unionists were doing was treasonous. Crawford was never even questioned. Casement hanged. Crawford free. Why? What is justice? Loretto groups, so there are a couple of questions to throw around in the groups in conversation with each other. So if we can be allocated to rooms now, and we'll take 20 minutes maybe